Thank you, Bernard. I just want to say before you go away, get out that swear jar because I was listening. I think the best thing we can do is call this time completely unprecedented. And I have to tell you, as a futurist, right, I have a podcast, hopefully you've all heard it, called The Next Billion Seconds, because as a futurist, this is this really good, useful unit of time. A billion seconds, 30 years, give or take. Futurists like to work in that length of time, and that is not possible right now. So my work as a futurist has become incredibly contracted. And for about the next half hour, I want to talk to you about what we can see in the next little while, particularly in New Zealand. And I have to say, I'm disappointed that I can't travel to you. One of the big advantages of my work is I get to visit New Zealand a couple of times a year. I have really good friends in Wellington. I have really good friends in Auckland. It's always a delight to come, and I'm missing actually being with you. But the reason I'm not, well, we all know the reason I'm not. This guy, all right? There's been a virus. That virus produced more change, more, I guess, unprecedented change in March and April of this year than we have seen in the entirety of our lives. And what that meant was that everything that looked very steady and very predictable became very unclear and mostly very, very unpredictable. But we're also starting to see some shape of what the future looks like. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look specifically with respect to New Zealand. Now, I want you to know I drafted this talk on Monday, and it's a sign of how rapidly things are changing, that some of the things I put in this talk on Monday, I had to go and amend yesterday. All right. There is your curve of infections, New Zealand. You have flattened the curve. It is incredible. You all know this. You can take a great big bow. I can tell you as an Australian, we look at that and we are jealous. We are envious of this, how well you've done with this. But before that happened, at this part of the curve over here, right, sort of up in the big peaky part up above my head, that was the part where things were so out of control that essentially what happened was everywhere around the world, more or less simultaneously, more or less centering on around the 12th of March here, 11th of March in the Western Hemisphere, 12th of March here, things were changing so rapidly that it became almost impossible to know hour to hour whether the next hour would be substantially the same as the hour that preceded it. So many things were being shut down, or quarantines were being imposed, or borders were being closed, or leaders were getting sick. Really didn't matter. It was just something every hour. I was actually talking to someone who was running a news desk at one of the large FM radio stations here in Australia. She said, we would go into the 3 o'clock report with one set of breaking news, and we're used to having maybe one breaking news story per day, and they would have 5 breaking news stories in the half hour that they were on air. That's how much things had changed and how quickly they had changed. All right, so the first thing that we had to do on the day it changed was actually get the exponential growth of the pandemic under control. Turns out what happens is when you have an exponential process, such as the progress of the pandemic happening, what it does is it basically fogs out your ability to plan. My friend Sally Dominguez, who's another futurist that I do a lot of work with, she said, Mark, the horizon line that we're accustomed to during an exponential process, such as a pandemic, that horizon line starts to rise up. It starts to rise up. And so all of a sudden, the horizon line becomes a brick wall. And you slam into that brick wall. When you slam into that brick wall, the only thing that you can do is lock down. The only thing you can do when you're in an exponential pandemic is do everything you can to exit that. And of course, New Zealand had even a more strict lockdown than we had in Australia. You folks just basically went inside. You did everything exactly right. And because you did everything exactly right, you flattened the curve. You brought everything under control. And what happened was, as the exponential declined, you got more and more of your horizon back. It became possible to see further and further into the future, so that the falling curve meant that you actually then got a clear view into the future. You have done such a good job at this that New Zealand, uniquely probably among the OECD countries, New Zealand has a clear view out for the entirety of the next fiscal year. So all of 2020-2021 fiscal year, you can probably plan successfully through that period. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be smooth sailing, as we've seen this week. But it means that you actually do have a view that allows you to plan. Even here in Australia, probably we can comfortably plan till around January of 2021. I think you're probably safe at going all the way through the year. Now, this year is going to be dominated by a couple of major trends, and I want to actually walk us through those because those trends will end up shaping everything that businesses need to be aware of. All right, so the first thing we have to be aware of is there's a paradox of success associated with elimination of the virus. Because effectively what it means is that New Zealand is now living under its own little dome. And of course, this has been very clear all along. The borders are functionally closed to New Zealand. And now, essentially what you're doing is you're living life under the dome and you're looking at the amount of air that's under the dome. And you're now wondering, given that amount of air under the dome, how long it's going to be until that air starts to get stale. And this is going to be the persistent feature of the environment for the next fiscal year. Because while this is happening, while you're under the dome, you're going to be looking out at the world beyond the dome and trying to get a sense for what that world is going to be like beyond the dome. But of course, we know what the world is like beyond the dome. The pandemic is raging out there. So we already know that there's a tension around being safe under the dome and having the dome open and it being radically unsafe. So what does that mean? Well, of course, New Zealand had declared itself eliminated last week. There was much rejoicing. Australia looked on with a degree of envy. And then as I was building the slide deck on Tuesday, this is when it was discovered that there were cases in New Zealand. And those cases have now, in some sense, reset the parameters for what they think is going on here. It points to the degree that things are basically kind of still unstable, capable of changing. You're safe as long as you can maintain the borders more or less completely. But what it means to maintain the dome for any length of time, that's something all of us are learning right now, and we're learning it as we're going along. And what we can see now is that we're going to be facing over the next year this increased tension between living under the dome and basically breathing the same economic air. And of course, Bernard was asking everyone where they're going for holidays in New Zealand. And of course, the same questions are now being asked in Australia, because this is the zone that we're going to have to live in. And we have to hope that there's enough economic activity within that zone to keep the economy puttering along. We're going to look to the world beyond as something that's clean and fresh, but at the same time, we're going to know that, in fact, if you open the dome, you're going to be letting the virus in. And that fundamental tension is going to frame almost all the decisions that governments, businesses, and institutions will be making over the next fiscal year. All right. That doesn't mean that that tension is always going to be answered correctly. Now, before the elimination had happened, there was a bit of a kerfuffle about the fact that the Avatar film crew had been let into Wellington, supposedly because the Avatar production had threatened to go elsewhere unless they were allowed to come into the country. So they were allowed to come into the country. They actually did sit through quarantine. I presume they're off making the film now. But these are the kinds of tensions that will end up framing commerce in New Zealand while you're under the dome. And of course, we're looking forward to the day, and it was just referenced by the person from New Zealand Tourism, of extending the dome so that the dome can be, as we're talking about it, a trans-Tasman dome. It's going to be really nice to be able to do that in New Zealand because New Zealand and Australia are very well-known countries to one another. They're very good friends. They understand the governmental structures. They understand the social structures between the countries really well. That's really important because this idea of widening the dome, of opening up the dome between two countries is going to require a huge amount of trust and goodwill on behalf of all of the parties involved. And so that's why it's a really good idea to begin this with a very friendly near neighbor. Because if you don't do it that way, then you're probably going to fumble some of the subtle signals you're going to need to do this as safely as possible. But the most important thing here is as we grow the trans-Tasman bubble, and this will not just be the governments doing this will be the businesses doing this will be trade and tourism doing this. So it will be happening on a broad scale. Every one of these organizations will be learning really important information about what it means to grow the bubble and how they can grow the bubble safely. And that means that growing that bubble is an important, necessary experiment in the world right now. We actually have to always be making steps to growing the bubble. Yes, start with Australia, and then probably Oceania, and then perhaps Taiwan or some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, which have also come very close to eradication. It will become natural, but the processes that are developed in the trans-Tasman bubble, those will become the prototypes for the bubbles between us and other countries. And so there's a lot of important things that can be learned here that will need to be carried forward over the next year. All right, the next point, something we're just starting to understand. Biosecurity is the new national security. Now, previously, biosecurity had pretty much been framed as an agricultural problem, right? There's the Biosecurity New Zealand logo, so it shows insects, shows some waste, some maybe bacteria getting in, because biosecurity was basically a problem that was connected to agriculture. So that if a bug got in, or if a virus got in that affected a plant, or even an animal, the damage might be measured in hundreds of millions, possibly even billions of dollars. What we now know is that damage because of holes in biosecurity creates economic wreckage measured in the trillions of dollars. We already know that the economic impact globally will be at least $5 to $10 trillion. It will probably be $1 trillion in Australia, probably $500 billion in New Zealand over the next few years. So we now know that there is a fundamental issue of national security and national economic security that is intimately connected with biosecurity. So this entire idea of national defense is about to get a very different flavor as national defense starts to pivot to this idea of biosecure defense. And we actually saw this. The interesting thing is New Zealand yesterday took the very first step in this direction. I'd written this into the talk, and then yesterday the Prime Minister appointed the military to start handling the quarantine. Why? Because biosecurity is national security. So all of a sudden, the national priorities about how you protect yourselves are going to start to reorganize themselves entirely around biosecurity and preserving your biosecurity. Now, this guy, Dr. was at Bloomfield, right? Apparently very, very popular over in New Zealand. Apparently you were all listening to his daily reports. He's got quite a fan club. My friends in Wellington tell me you can get t-shirts with his photo on it. So I guess he's got quite a fan following now. He is the Deputy Director of Health, so he's the Chief Health Officer of the nation. We have a Chief Medical Officer with an equivalent role here in Australia. Now, here's the thing. Once you've decided, or actually once circumstances have decided that biosecurity is national security, the chief health officer for a nation becomes incredibly important. In an interesting way, that person becomes the most powerful person in the country. Now, that doesn't mean this is an undemocratic act, because he can be replaced, he can be asked to resign, he could be fired. He still answers to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the government of New Zealand. But at the same time, the government and anyone in the government would be very unlikely to disagree with any recommendations that he makes about how to preserve the biosecurity of the nation. In a real tangible sense that simply wasn't true 3 months ago, his word's law. All right, and his word's law because everyone understands exactly why this is so important. So you're now starting to understand how that shift to biosecurity is national security, how that actually plays out in practice. Because this role is now about to become a pivotal role, particularly over the next fiscal year, particularly over the period of time where the bubble is being maintained in New Zealand. All right. Part of what comes out now is to come directly into the role of the CFO. During the period of the bubble, we're going to take a look at all of our business processes and take a look at how to make them as contactless as possible. I was talking to someone last night who runs a lot of events, and she's like, you realize that even when we can go back to doing events in person, proper social distancing, people can't share a microphone anymore because just the process of handing over a microphone means there's a point of contact that can be a vector for infection. I hadn't thought about this, and I give hundreds of talks a year. I hadn't actually thought about that aspect. We're making a rapid migration into a new way of thinking about how we interact with one another and how we transact business in a way that involves the least amount of touch. And let me tell you, in Australia, in March, one of the top Google searches was, how do I clean money? Which is really funny because in Australia, as in New Zealand, our money is made out of plastic and it's really easy to clean. But all of a sudden, physical banknotes had been seen as very dirty, as bearers of disease, and people wanted nothing to do with them. And of course, many of the cafes and businesses here that remained open during the lockdown stopped taking physical cash. Most of them still aren't taking physical cash, even as we exit the lockdown. And Australians basically went from 0 to 1 in cashless culture. Now, I haven't seen any figures in New Zealand, but I'm assuming that the same thing happened there, that you're using touchless payments at a much greater degree than you were before. And this indicates a much larger shift that's happening macroeconomically toward digital payments as the primary form of payments across the economy. And so the CFO is going to have to think about integrating digital payments completely through all of their processes because that's going to be the preferred form. But the other side of it is that digital banking, which had also been happening in the background in Australia and has also been happening in the background in New Zealand, because digital banking by its nature is contactless, digital banking got an enormous acceleration. So probably moved the ball, as they say, 5 years in about the 10 weeks that people were in, because all of a sudden digital banking makes a lot more sense than branch-based banking. And so you're going to see a lot of developments here that are happening much more rapidly than we would have predicted even in January of this year because of this migration toward contactless. So you now have to start to think about, what does a contactless business bank look like? Business banking has always been based on relationships and connections and actually getting together and talking things out. And so all of a sudden there's going to be a complete redesign of that relationship so that it satisfies the relational element but does it in a way that's contactless. And then there's what's happening to work. And of course, as we heard from Kerry from Westpac, she had to figure out very quickly what it meant to get everyone working from home very quickly. And we've all managed to do that more or less with differing degrees of success. One of the best things about finance, this chart shows you that finance is one of the areas that is the most amenable to working from home. It actually fits the ideal almost perfectly. Software is probably a little bit better by the nature of its practice, but finance actually works really well when it's done remotely. So in some sense, the transition for the CFO to this distributed work from home, work from anywhere workforce has been relatively seamless, relatively easy. There's probably been a period of time building the tools up and getting people across those tools. And again, as Kerry pointed out, getting people together just to have a conversation about how things are going, because that's also increasingly important in a contactless world, is maintaining those relationships. And this points to a new role for the CFO that we hadn't planned on, that wasn't really even in view at the beginning of this year, which is that in some sense, the CFO has to be the social glue that's holding the team together, because the team is no longer being held together in space and time. The team is maybe working from home. Working from home is starting to become work from anywhere. We're going to have to be very careful to make sure that work from anywhere doesn't immediately become work all the time, because then we're going to lose some of the best features of the flexibility involved. But now a CFO is going to be like, okay, I have my staff working whenever they can, wherever they want to, around the projects that we've all agreed. How do I maintain coherence in that environment? How do I maintain esprit de corps in that environment? How do I allow our teams to self-organize so that they can reach their goals for the group? And these are the questions that are easy to answer when we're face-to-face, that just kind of fall out of the fact that we're social human beings, but become much more nuanced when we're doing it over a Zoom call over a webinar. And so this is a whole new set of challenges that aren't financial related. They're management related, they're relational, that are now front and center, going to be part of the CFO's practice, and that the CFO will be feeling it perhaps more than any other single part of the organization, because the CFO's function and the finance function is so amenable to work from home. All right. This is an experiment. This is all an experiment. This is why we aren't getting it right. This is why those 2 women broke quarantine even though they were infected and went across the country, because we're still learning all of these processes. None of us are going to be perfect at this, and we have to understand that the shape of the future is going to be different than even what we expect from here, because we are still learning as we go along. It's not just a matter of sanitizing the office and building in a little social distancing and everything's going to go back to normal. It's probably not going to work that way. And that means the most important thing we need to do is to design all of our processes to be able to plan for change. I really liked it when Kerry said that she was actually having to communicate with the Reserve Bank every single day to let them know the bank's cash position. It's good to know that the Reserve Bank is keeping their eye on that. It's also good to know that Westpac was ready to be able to engage with the Reserve Bank at that very acute period of the pandemic, keeping them up to date. And again, this is the Reserve Bank basically losing their forward ability to plan, that their forward planning horizon has become so tight that they need to check in with their major financial institutions every single day. And those financial institutions will be checking in with themselves every single day, because so much will have changed day to day that means that there needs to be a very intense cycle of observation and planning. And frankly, you just have to accept the fact that over the next year, the one thing that I can promise you is that the goalposts will continue to move. You will set up a plan, you will get yourself on a trajectory, and as you're approaching your goal, they're going to move. Something's going to change. There's going to be a change to the rule. There's going to be a change to practices. There's going to be an outbreak here, or whatever it's going to be. The thing we can be assured of is that the basic thing is that conditions will continue to change throughout the next fiscal year. Now, that doesn't mean you can't plan it all, but it does mean that all of your planning has to have embedded within it an agility and a flexibility to change. And so that means that the financial planning cycle now, we like to think of it as an annual planning cycle, perhaps a quarterly planning cycle. We are not, for the next little while, going to have the luxury of such extended vistas being the only planning vistas. Yes, you're going to do your annual plan. Yes, you will do your quarterly plan, but you will be looking at things, and you probably are looking at things weekly and perhaps daily, depending on what's going on. And you're going to need to actually take that data in and use that to continuously revise your plans. That this is the key to making through it. Now, the benefit here, and this is the silver lining in this, is that the organizations that master that get a flexibility in their operation that allows them to respond to the conditions of the rapidly changing environment. In other words, the organizations that can learn from their mistakes are the organizations that will thrive, that will come through the pandemic to the other side when all of the bubbles have opened again, when there's a vaccine, when the pandemic is just a memory. Those organizations will come through both coherent and capable of amazing new things precisely because they learned during this rapidly changing time how to cope and how to adapt and how to thrive in that change. Thank you.